This is an overview of Chapter 24, Aggregate Supply and Demand. We're going to cover aggregate demand, aggregate supply. We're going to briefly touch upon macroeconomic equilibrium at long run and short run. And that's the general overview of what we'll cover from this chapter. So in the beginning of the chapter, there's a story about FedEx and following the business cycle. Some of Wall Street's analysts use a FedEx indicator to gauge the state of the economy because there will usually be a close relationship between fluctuations in FedEx businesses and fluctuations in GDP. Despite FedEx's tremendous success over the past 40 years, the business cycle has always affected the company's business. To understand how the business cycle affects FedEx and other firms, we need to explore the effects of the recessions and expansions have on production, employment, and prices. Is an employer likely to cut your pay during a recession? Suppose you have worked as a barista for a local coffee house for 2 years. From on-the-job training and experience, you have honed your coffee-making skills and mastered the perfect latte. Then the economy moves into a recession and sales at the coffee house decline. See if you can answer these questions by the end of the chapter. Is the owner of the coffee house likely to cut the prices of lattes and other drinks? If the owner asks to meet with you to discuss your wage for next year, is he or she likely to cut your pay? Aggregate demand. So in chapter 3 we covered supply and demand, but this is for a specific marketplace. Now we're talking about supply and demand in the economy as a whole, or macroeconomic, aggregate supply and demand. It identifies determinants of aggregate demand and distinguishes between movement along the curve and aggregate demand curve and a shift in the curve. An aggregate demand and supply model is a model that explains short-run fluctuation in real GDP. So we have price level instead of price, and then real GDP, which is how much real GDP are we demanding in the entire economy. In the short run, real GDP and the price level are determined by the intersection of the aggregate demand curve and the short run aggregate supply curve. Real GDP is measured on the horizontal axis, and the price level is measured on the vertical axis by the GDP deflator. An aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between price level and the quantity of real GDP demanded by households, firms, and the government. Short-run aggregate supply curve is a curve that shows the relationship between short-run price level and the quantity of real GDP supplied by firms. Because we are dealing with the economy as a whole, we need macroeconomic explanations of why aggregate demand is downward sloping and why short-run aggregate supply is upward sloping. Why is aggregate demand downward sloping? Recall from chapter 19, GDP, and the 4 components. The first one is consumption. This is at least 70% of our economy, and this is based on what the consumers are spending on consumption items. Then we have investment, which is investment in fixed assets, inventories, and purchases of new homes by personal new homes, as well as buildings by businesses. Then we have government purchases. This is government spending on some goods and services during the year. And net exports. In the U.S., it has been a negative number because we've imported more than we've exported. The aggregate demand is a downward sloping because a fall in price level increases the quantity of real GDP demanded. To see why, we will look at how changes in the price level affect each component of aggregate demand, assuming government purchases is not affected. So consumption, investment, and net exports will be affected, but government purchases is not changed by price level. The wealth effect. So this is the first one. How a change in price level affects consumption. Some of a household's wealth, the difference between the value of its assets and the value of its debt, is held in cash or other nominal assets that lose value as price level rises and gain value as price level falls. When this price level falls, the real value of household wealth rises, and so consumption and demand for goods and services will increase. This is called the wealth effect. Second is the interest rate effect, how a change in price level affects investment. A higher price level increases the interest rate and reduces investment spending. Of course, if it's going to cost me more interest to buy fixed assets or buy a building, therefore I'm less likely to invest at a higher price level. A lower price level will decrease interest rates and increase investment spending, thereby increasing the quantity of goods and services demanded, otherwise known as the interest rate effect. The third one is the international trade effect, and this one seems to be confusing for students to understand, but I'm going to run through it. And remember, we're thinking about what is the value of the dollar and how is this affecting trade. So how a change in price level affects net exports. Net exports equals spending by foreign households and firms on goods and services produced in the United States minus spending by the U.S. households and firms on goods and services produced in other countries. At a higher price level in the United States relative to other countries causes net exports to fall. Think about it. If we have a higher price level, which means things are going to cost more here, then if you're trading and we're exporting things, people aren't going to be able to afford it, reducing the quantity of goods and services demanded, or real GDP. At a lower price level in the United States relative to other countries, this would cause net exports to rise, increasing the goods or services demanded through the international trade effect. Shifts of the aggregate demand curve versus movements along the curve. The aggregate demand curve tells us the relationship between price level and the quantity of real GDP demanded, holding everything else constant. If the price level changes, but other variables that affect the willingness of households, firms, and governments to spend are unchanged, the economy will move up and down the stationary aggregate demand curve. This is movement along the same curve. Same idea as if the price level changed in the hamburgers situation in the hamburger market, that would be movement on the curve, not a shift in the curve. So this applies, but on a macroeconomic level. If any variable other than price level changes, then this will cause a demand curve shift. The variables that fall into three categories: changes in government policies, changes in expectations of households and firms, and changes in foreign variables. Now, we will talk about what monetary and fiscal policy are in more in depth in later chapters, but the overall view is monetary policy is the action taken by the Federal Reserve to manage money, supply, and interest rates to pursue macroeconomic policy objectives. Lower interest rates shift aggregate demand to the right. Consumption and investment spending will increase. Again, remember, if general interest rates are lower, we're more likely to purchase a new home. We're more likely to invest in business fixed assets. We're more likely to do general spending. And a higher interest rate would shift the aggregate demand curve left, as consumption investment spending would go down or decrease. Fiscal policy changes in federal taxes and purchases intended to achieve macroeconomic policy objectives. An increase in government purchases or a decrease in taxes shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, increasing aggregate demand. And a decrease in government purchases or an increase in taxes would shift it to the left, inward, or decreasing aggregate demand. Now, the second category is changes in expectations by households and firms. If households become more optimistic about their future incomes and firms become more optimistic about the future profitability of investment spending, then the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. Think about all the talk about how this is going to be a great holiday shopping season and businesses are feeling better about this, and this is changes in consumer expectation, right? Conversely, if you're feeling more pessimistic, aggregate demand curve would shift to the left. People are less likely to spend money on holiday gifts or electronics or discretionary items if they feel pessimistic about their future earnings. And the third category is changes in foreign variables. If firms and households in other countries buy fewer U.S. goods, or if firms and households in the United States buy more foreign goods, net exports will fall. and aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. If real GDP in the United States increases faster than real GDP in other countries, net exports will fall. Conversely, if it grows more slowly, net exports will rise. If the exchange rate between the dollar and foreign currency rises, net exports will fall. This is because a strong dollar means that we can buy more stuff from other countries because our dollar is strong compared to theirs. It's worth more. So that means we would import more items and therefore reducing net exports. Net exports will increase if the dollar falls against other currencies. An increase in net exports at every price level will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. A change in net exports that results from a change in price level in the United States will just result in movement along the same demand curve. It will not shift the curve. So this is talking about a change in price level. So if price level went from 110 to 115, then that would just be movement along the same curve, and real GDP would be 14.2 and it would go to 14.0 because, of course, it's downward sloping because of the three things that we just talked about. Now suppose that we know that the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left, given all the information, assuming that at every price level, the quantity of real GDP declines by $300 billion. The graph would look like this. So instead of being movement on the same curve where we went back to 14.0, it's a shift in aggregate demand inward, which is decrease, which means at the price level of 110, we used to demand 14.2, but now we demand 13.9 of real GDP. So talking about things that would shift the aggregate demand curve. So think about the economy as a whole. If there is an increase in interest rates, aggregate demand would shift left. Higher interest rates mean a higher cost of borrowing money for households and firms, reducing consumption and investment. If there is an increase in government purchases, this adds to GDP. Therefore, we are going to demand more. Government purchases are a component of aggregate demand. If there's an increase in personal income taxes or business income taxes, an increase in tax will shift aggregate demand to the left. Consumption spending falls when personal taxes rise, and investment spending falls when business taxes rise. An increase in households' expectation of their future income. If I think I'm going to earn more money and I'm feeling more secure, then I'm going to shift it to the right. Consumption spending would increase. If firms expect future profitability to be more, then they're more likely to spend on investments, so therefore shifting aggregate demand to the right. If the growth rate of domestic GDP relative to the growth rate of foreign GDP, so if we think our economy is going to grow faster than other economies, that actually decreases net exports, therefore shifting the aggregate demand curve to the left. And an increase in exchange rate. So if the value of the dollar goes up relative to foreign currency, aggregate demand will go down because we'll be importing more items and exports will fall. Net exports will be reduced. The table shows a shift in aggregate demand that results from an increase in each of these variables. A decrease in the variables would cause aggregate demand curve to shift in the opposite direction. Which components of aggregate demand changed the most during the 2007 to 2009 recession? So GDP, this is components of GDP. So it was approximately 70% of GDP, and then in 2009, consumption actually went to 65%. That's because consumer confidence fell. We felt insecure, people lost their jobs, and therefore we have been moving back up towards the 70. But realistically, it fell significantly during the recession. Also, 6% or slightly over in 2005, in the height of the real estate market booming, it represented 6% of real GDP, residential investment, and it was down a little over 2% in 2009. net exports actually increased as a percentage because it was negative, so -7, and it went in 2009. It reached its height of -3. That's because our economy was not doing well compared to other economies, which means we were increasing exports. Identifying determinants of aggregate supply and distinguishing between movement along the short run aggregate supply and a shift in the curve. Because the effect of changes in price level on aggregate supply is very different in the short run as it is in the long run, we use two supply curves. So this is the difference. We're going to use a long run aggregate supply is basically a vertical line. In the long run, levels of real GDP is determined by the number of workers, capital stock, and available technology, which none of these are actually affected by a change in price level. We can't make more people available to work than there really are, just because there's a change in price level. So in the long run, changes in price level do not affect real GDP. That is why it's a vertical line. Remember that the level of real GDP in the long run is called potential GDP or full employment GDP. So it's referred to going forward as a LRAS or a long run aggregate supply curve. It shows the relationship between price level and quantity of real GDP supply. As you can see, it is only a vertical line. No matter what the price level is, potential GDP remains the same. The only way there'll be a shift in the curve is if there's a shift in one of the things that would actually increase real GDP or potential GDP. Each year, long-run aggregate supply shifts to the right as the number of workers in the economy increase, more machinery and equipment are accumulated, and technology changes our ability to produce things. In the short run, though, there are things that would make the supply curve, the short run aggregate supply curve, be upward sloping. As prices of final goods and services rise, price of inputs, such as wages of workers or price of natural resources, rise more slowly. The reason for this is that firms and workers fail to accurately predict changes in price levels. There are three common explanations for the short run aggregate supply curve for being upward sloping when workers and firms fail to accurately predict the price level. Number one is that contracts make some wages and prices sticky. Firms are often slow to adjust their wages, and menu costs make some prices sticky. Contracts make some prices sticky, or wages sticky, means that prices or wages are said to be sticky when they don't respond quickly to changes in demand or supply. The reason being is if we have a contract, then I'm set to pay that whether the economy is doing well or not. Firms are often slow to adjust wages. If firms are slow to adjust wages, a rise in price level will increase the profitability of hiring more workers and producing more output, and a fall in price level will decrease the profitability of hiring more workers and producing more output. Firms are often slower to cut wages than to increase them. And this is true. But I did see several different types, lawyers in particular in the 2007 to 9 recession, take pay cuts actually. Not only just forego raises, but take pay cuts across the board. But that is usually not the case. In a business cycle recession, most of the time, firms don't cut your wages, they just don't increase your wages. Menu costs make some prices sticky is another term for why it's upward sloping. And firms base their prices today partly on what they expect future prices to be. And changing those prices to account for unexpected increase in price level can be costly. Menu costs are the cost of the firms for changing prices. Shifts of the short-run aggregate supply versus movement along the same short-run aggregate supply. The short-run aggregate supply curve tells us the relationship in the short run between price level and the quantity of goods and services firms are willing to supply, holding all other variables constant that affect the willingness of firms to supply goods and services. If a price level changes but other variables are unchanged, the economy will move up and down a stationary aggregate supply curve. If any variable other than price level changes, this will shift the curve. Several variables that shift a short-run aggregate supply curve are listed below. Number one is increase in the labor force and in capital stock. As labor force and capital stock grow, firms will supply more output at every price level, and the short-run aggregate supply curve would shift to the right, or increase. If there is a technology change, as positive technology changes take place, the productivity of workers and machineries increase, which reduces firms' cost of production and allows them to produce more output at every price level, shifting the curve to the right. So, movement from 100 to 103 on the price level is actually a shift in the curve. Other things are expected changes in future price level. If workers and firms expect future price levels to increase by a certain percentage, then the curve will shift by an equivalent amount, holding all other variables constant. And then we have what is called adjustment of workers and firms to past errors and expectations about price levels. Again, sometimes we miss the price level changes. We don't see it coming. If workers and firms across the economy are adjusting to price levels being higher than they expected, this will shift short-run aggregate supply to the left, because if it was higher than expected, it costs more, correct? If their adjusting price levels were lower than expected, then it would shift the curve to the right. Unexpected changes in the price level of an important natural resource is another thing that's going to change. Supply shock is an unexpected event that causes short-run aggregate supply curve to shift. So let's talk about some things that would cause it to shift. If there's an increase in the labor force or capital stock, that would cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift right. More output can be produced at every price level. If there's an increase in productivity, then it would cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. The cost of producing would fall, therefore shifting it to the right. If there's an increase in expected future price level, that would actually cause it to shift left, because they believe that an increase in future price level will cost the firms more money. If there's an increase in workers and firms having to adjust to previously underestimating the price, that will cause it to shift left. Workers and firms increase wages and prices. And if there's an increase in the expected price of a natural important resource, so if oil prices suddenly spike, that's going to shift to the left, causing the cost of production to rise. And the only thing that you guys need to know about the macroeconomic equilibrium for long run and short run, it is when actually all three lines cross. It is the point where long run aggregate supply, so potential GDP, short run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand all meet. That is the long run macroeconomic equilibrium for an economy. And that's where we're going to stop in these slides, actually.